let me just say good morning to everybody, and I just want a big shout out to you all who are now the movers and shakers of this field. As Ann pointed out, was probably pretty tiny 10 years ago. But I want to recognize Bob Friedman. I was reflecting, I think I met Bob almost 20 years ago at a small philanthropic conference in San Diego when I heard the first story about assets for all and how maybe assets might be a way to think about confronting the issues of poverty. And it struck me at that time that so many of the things we did in education and health and all the human services work we did and the community-based work we did, we never really dealt with the consequences of poverty, but we didn't deal with the lack of economic resources. And it made so much sense when he talked about Professor Sherrodden's book. But a good idea isn't what changes the world. It's what we're seeing Jose do in San Francisco and where CFED has taken it. So I do want to think a little bit for a moment today about where the field has been and where it's going, and what are the spaces of innovation that are right in front of us. Anne referred to several in terms of this now hearing more often the notion of two and dual generations. And I appreciated her harking us back to Head Start, which, as she said, was supposed to be a whole family program. It wasn't just an early childhood program. But now, as we will hear, to have the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, Treasury, Labor, so many parts of our federal system and now our state and local systems are starting to discover the power of assets as being a key element. But I want to suggest that the notion of an integrated approach, one that doesn't just look at assets and fill in the blank. This morning, we are powerfully looking at assets and learning and assets and education. And that video is so inspiring to look at how that is changing families. Jose referred to this, so did Ann. The notion of social capital being linked to financial capital, being linked to human capital. It's very interesting that we live in a society that is proud of two things: our political system, which is a democracy, and our economic system, which is called capitalism. Too many people cringe when we talk about capitalism because they tend to identify capitalists with a very small portion of our society. I would suggest what CFED has done over the last 20 years is democratize capitalism. And to say, of course, those little kids are learning the power of compounding interest and capital. Virtually every state constitution in this country has a clause in it which says all the students in our state will be taught the principles of the free enterprise system. Why would that be in a state constitution? Because the state constitutions were written based on the principles that people needed to understand the fundamentals of our society, democracy and capitalism. But do you remember what you learned about the free enterprise system in high school or in middle school? I suggest these kindergartners in San Francisco and all of our savers that we're going to hear from, they're learning about it because they're practicing it. It's not a concept in a textbook in a classroom, it's something they do. So I think the notion of integration, of connecting the idea of asset building, of income and savings to everything else we do. Now, our road to this at the Kellogg Foundation, as Ann talked about a little bit, has been a similar path. We started 80 years ago with the generosity of Will Keith Kellogg, focusing on education and health. And we did some amazing work over the decades in many different fields, and those continue to be the two pillars that we really focus on. But we added this third pillar of family economic security when Ann joined us and we were looking at our new strategic framework of promoting the health, happiness, and well-being of children, as Mr. Kellogg gave us that mandate. I was in the back of my head saying, we're going to do health, we're going to do education, but we're not addressing, as Bob had taught me decades ago, what about the family's economic situation? How are you going to address that? And that in its whole self. So I'm excited that the Kellogg Foundation is one of the few private foundations now, but I hope we'll be joined by many more, and we're seeing people starting to connect one of their program areas with this new area. That we look at health, we look at education, and we look at family economic security. So whatever we try to do to incubate and innovate, will be the attempt to integrate. And I also want to recognize my great colleague, Alandra Washington, because we spent many long hours after work playing with the ideas we want to propose to our board and our staff, and to build, as we saw in Jose's presentation, what we already know about asset building strategies and where is the new space in the frontiers. So whatever I say, I will expect Alandra to carry out. Now, so this notion of integration, 3 kinds of capital, financial, human, and social, dealing with every aspect of a family's life, not just one dimension. And I love this morning people talking about not just financial literacy of families in an education setting or in a health setting, or looking at their food they eat, but their financial capabilities. So we will always ask ourselves how we can link our asset building investments to those other domains. I also think there's a dimension of innovation that you all must be thinking about, which is the notion of sequencing and truly building the ladder that Andrea talked about. We see in San Francisco a program that's having phenomenal success that starts at kindergarten. Those of us in the early childhood space think about learning starting at birth. So we played with the idea of what if we have universal child savings accounts, as Jose said, that are automatic, that are linked, starting at birth. We have in our sister city of Kalamazoo one of the most remarkable programs in the country called the Kalamazoo Promise. Many of you have probably heard about it. A group of anonymous donors unilaterally announced to the community in 2005 that every child graduating from Kalamazoo Public Schools would have free college tuition to any public university they could get into in the state of Michigan. It was a game changer, and the notion that if I'm born today and I graduate from a Kalamazoo Public School, high school, college tuition, first dollar college tuition, not last dollar college tuition, waiting for me at the finish line 18 years out. The question we've asked ourselves is, why aren't more low-income and poor families getting to that finish line? Because the donors of the Kalamazoo Promise could not afford to also put money into early childhood and the K-12 system. They just put this powerful incentive. So what we ask ourselves is, how do we sequence and ladder incentives and rewards and participation so that more kids, starting at birth, starting at kindergarten, starting in middle school, don't just see that incentive out there at high school graduation, but actually are building it for themselves. And I think that's what San Francisco is teaching us. It's not just the prize, it's the ownership and the contribution that those kindergartners and their parents are making to build that prize. And that's why we need more people offering that match, offering that incentive, offering that reward. The notion that you could say to the parent of a newborn that you have an automatic child savings account just the way San Francisco does it for kindergartners, and by the time your child turns 5 and walks into kindergarten ready to learn, that savings account may have already grown to $5,000 or $10,000. That keeps a person's eyes on the prize today and not 18 years away. So I think that's a space of innovation in terms of sequencing, incentives, rewards, and ownership that we should really be exploring. So that, I think also the notion of integration and sequencing, I am so delighted my good friend and colleague from our Silicon Valley days, Undersecretary Martha Cantor, is coming next. Because what the field tells us about critiques of our trying to work in an integrated manner is, if you're in the health world, you have a culture that doesn't think about assets. If you're an early childhood educator or a teacher, you don't think about assets. So we have conflicting cultures, we have conflicting goals, and the literature says we don't have policy integration at the top, federal, state, or local level. So to have the treasurer of San Francisco, like Jose, be the champion of an asset building strategy that's being launched out of public schools is a very powerful symbol of integration and connection. That's what we're going to need. We're going to need more investments, we're going to need more integration, we're going to need more sequencing, and more experimentation. And that's what I think CFED has really helped us do. So with that, I want to welcome my great friend and marvelous undersecretary, Martha Cantor. When I was called, not by the Secret Service, whoever does the vetting of candidates being nominated for undersecretary, And I was told Martha Cantor is being nominated by the secretary to be an undersecretary. I was thrilled. Now, what she's done with this platform, and what I know, I don't know what she's going to tell us, but I do know what she's going to tell us because she told us at breakfast, is nothing short of amazing. And I don't think anyone could have anticipated 10 or 20 years ago that the light bulbs of how assets are connected to education and labor and treasury would actually come on during this administration and not only be a great idea, but to actually be executed in what usually takes decades to happen is happening what seems like the blink of an eye.